Well, we'll have a talk about the public service. So, the public service reports that in Queensland, nearly 18% of the community identifies as having a disability, but only 3% of those people are working for the public service. The They're trying to address this discrepancy. They've set themselves the mammoth task of hiring 14,570 more people with a disability by 2022, which is 8% of the workforce. So, do you reckon you could find 14,570 qualified people of any kind for a job in your business within 14 months? And could you do it for people who have a disability who are qualified for the roles in your business? Because you're looking at trying to find 1,040 people every month. River Knight is the co-founder of Developing Australian Communities, and he's got more than 2 decades experience working in the disability sector. River, this sounds like quite an ambitious target. Is it maybe a little bit too ambitious?
Hi, I think it's going to come down to what they actually mean by improving those statistics because as someone who's actually worked in the public service sector for a number of years, one of the things that I noticed is the majority of people that I met with a disability never tick that box to say that you have a disability in the public service sector. So the statistics are a bit skewed. So maybe a bit of a program around that might help improve those statistics because I think we're underreporting a lot, but also there's a lot of people with disabilities that are looking to work in the public service sector. But I can tell you what, it's a stringent process to get a job in the public service sector, especially depending on which area you're looking at.
I have heard they've been going through their existing staff, basically trying to see if people might tick that I have a disability box, which will then increase their percentage figures without them actually having to employ more people. Is that a bit dodgy, or is that really a legitimate way given how many people they're trying to, or the size of the percentage they're trying to get into the workforce there?
Well, one of the things that I've found over the years working in different sectors is that there's also that culture of really wanting to admit that you have a disability because when you're going to an employment setting, it's a competitive setting and it's that I guess double-edged sword. If I write that I have a disability, is that going to come up against me at some stage? If I don't write it, does that mean I'm not going to get the supports that I really need in that setting? Because not everyone with a disability has a wheelchair. It's also neurological, it's psychiatric disability, and it's about sort of going, well, I don't know if I feel comfortable putting that on the table in the interview because I'm not sure if I'm going to get the job or not. And also, we don't want tokenism. We want people that are qualified to do the work, not put into a role just because they fit the box at the moment. We've seen that with a bunch of different populations around the country where we've decided that we want to do the reverse of discrimination. And we want to make sure that the right people get the right jobs, but also look at the process. Do I feel comfortable flagging I have a disability or not is probably a really big question for the public sector.
And I suppose that's an important thing for anyone in their job, that they feel like that they've got that job because they're the best person for it. They're good at it, that job. It's not that there is no suggestion that they've got that job because they tick some kind of box.
And I think there's a bit of a reluctance because I know when I worked in the public sector, I'm someone who comes from a background where I have Tourette's syndrome and autism. So, I'm a bit uncomfortable just putting that up front. And, when I get into senior roles, and I've worked in very senior roles all over the country, and I currently work in two very senior national roles, you kind of think, well, is that going to help me prevent me from progressing if I admit that I have a psychiatric or an intellectual disability, neurological disability? Is that going to prevent things, or is that going to skew the interview, or can I be interviewed on my actual, I guess, presentation and capacity without having that kind of skewed box? And I know one of the things that happens a lot is, I don't tick that box to say that I come from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. I do, but I don't like to tick that because I don't like that discrimination. So it's a hard one. We definitely need more people with disabilities in the workforce, especially in the public sector. But we also need to look at that cultural thing of how do we actually go about reporting that statistic? Because sometimes it's a thing that people are reluctant to really admit.
I suppose there's a privacy issue in there too. I mean, if you are living with a disability, what business is it of anyone else's? If you can do your job and you that's what you're there for. What does it matter whether you've got a disability or not?
Sometimes it feels like that. I mean, I always, for myself, I never wanted to tick that box. And in one public sector job, I did tick the box and say, yes, I identify as someone with a disability. And I got all of the internal government emails all about, hey, if you come from that kind of background, we've got this thing going on. And thank you for waiting. And you just sort of go, oh, I don't really feel comfortable now. I'm being targeted. And I feel like I'm this token person in the office, as opposed to, a peer. So I don't want to discourage this campaign, and I think it's hugely important that we get more people with disabilities into the public sector. We'll also need to look at those public sector spaces, because I know people with a physical disability, a lot of our public sector spaces and workplaces are not always the most accessible.
And I suppose this leads to the flip side of this whole discussion we've just been having right now. On the one hand, there's privacy issues. There's the idea of could I face discrimination because of this? But then on the other hand, there's the role of the public service, or the ability of the public service to act as a lead employer in terms of showing leadership to other employers. And if they can meet that target and say, well, look, we've got 8% of our people are living with a disability and everything's just going swimmy, why don't you, that private organisation over there, do the same thing and break down that prejudice and that discrimination?
And it is, because it's something that most employers are very careful of. I'm not really allowed to just say, do you have a disability? As an employer, I can say, look, is there something that we need to know that might affect your ability to perform the role? But, I've got a lot of laws and rules around what I'm allowed to ask in interviews. So even when I go into an interview, whether it's public sector or private sector, there's a lot of rules around what you can actually ask a person. And just straight up asking someone, hey, do you tick that box, is actually really inappropriate in a lot of ways. It also breaches some of those workplace standards. But at the same time, you always worry that, is that employer looking at me as a potential work cover claim, and is that going to go against me?
I suppose, yeah, and that's kind of the thing with it too. It's like, it's inappropriate, but why is it inappropriate? And you can put that point to whether you're talking about disability or gender or race or any of those kinds of things. But the reason they're inappropriate is because they're things that get used as a door handle for discrimination. If they're things that are being asked because they might be relevant to making sure you're providing the right thing so that employee can do their job properly. And I'm struggling to think of another example, but like it's about where it comes from, really, isn't it?
And there's a good rationale behind it. If I've got an employee and I want to be inclusive, and I know that someone's coming into my workplace that has a wheelchair, then I'm going to need to know that, because I want to make sure that accessible office space is set up for them, so they don't get there on the first day and they can't get in the building. So we don't want to have that issue. But we also need to think about those other barriers, because the majority of people that have a disability, it's not a physical disability, it's a neurological disability, it's a psychiatric disability, it's other things that you don't see. And it's about, well, what are the barriers in the workplace for people in that group? What are the cultural barriers, the emotional barriers, the way that people treat and either include or just don't include certain people in our community, and value or devalue them, the way they talk about people and the way they work with them in the workplace, because those sorts of barriers are also just as important as those physical barriers.
So then, in that context, this goal that the Queensland Public Service has got of meeting that 8% of employing those 14, or having at least showing that they've employed those 14,000 or more than 14,000 people, how important is that?
I think it's hugely important, because with such a huge population of people in our community that have a disability, and we need to make sure that they are at the forefront, especially in areas, government departments like, advocacy, public guardian, disability services, health and human services. How do we create and deliver health services for people with a disability, if we don't have any of them actually there leading the way and actually being part of that boardroom decision? So we need those people there, and we need them to be employed. So we need to also look at the way we employ, because every government or public sector job I've ever had has always been a temporary job, because everyone else is acting in someone else's position, and it's really hard to get a permanent job. let alone a temporary job in the public sector. So we also need to make sure that people actually understand how to progress and how to apply and how to be successful, and then actually, hit those targets, whether it's gender, whether it's disability, whatever group we want to really reflect, that reflects our community. We've got to make sure we do it in a way that's not just simply just apply because you have a disability. It's like, you know what? Regardless of disability, this is how you get into those roles and this is how we support you. And yes, disability shouldn't be an issue, but we do need to encourage a workforce that's far more inclusive and actually represents our community.
In terms of the goal itself, though, like it's hard to imagine they're going to be able to meet that goal to employ that 1,040 people a month over between now and 2022.
It's
Or
a mammoth job for the HR department just to interview that many people. I think I'd say we're going to see movement just simply from statistics internally to say, you know what, a huge part of our workforce lives and experiences disability. So let's get that reporting up to scratch. And we guarantee we're not going to discriminate against you because you actually let us know that you are living with a disability. That'd be a good start because I think that'll help the statistics. But I can't see them recruiting that many people. But you know what? If they tapped into like Queenslanders with disability networks, some of those advocacy groups, some of the disability networks, I can guarantee they would get a lot of applicants very fast.
is this, though, they've just sat on their hands and waited too long before they've started with this? Or is it, and I suppose the other question is if they have this goal and then they don't meet it, like what does that say? Like if you miss a goal like that, then it presumably just is easier to continue missing it.
Well, I don't see anything done in government quickly. So
That's true.
I'd be very surprised for them to do this mammoth task unless they've already done a lot of groundwork already. So unless they've got that ball rolling and they've done a lot of work strategically to just really focus on that target, there's no way if they started today, I can see them hitting that goal. But I think what's been going on in the background is there's been quite a lot of work internally within HR and within recruitment to really work on those targets. And I think they've done a lot of work leading up to this. And I think they're probably quite hopeful that they will reach that benchmark. And it wouldn't surprise me if they get close because there's a lot of agencies and stakeholders that could really help. And I think that's something that they if they tap into and try not to do this alone, that's something that will achieve that goal.
All right, River Knight, thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's River Knight. He's the co-founder of Developing Australian Communities and has had more than 2 decades experience in disability advocacy.